So it's a little bit after 12:30. Let's give it another minute or two, and then we can get started. Bob and Katie, you guys ready to go?
Sure, yes.
Great. Okay, so welcome everyone. I am Andy Sidman, and with me today are Tom Roberts and Katie Rockwood. And we're going to talk a little bit about the investment of, well, there's us, the investment of public funds. Now, you know, you guys have attended a lot of seminars and conferences and webinars, and you've heard probably more than you can possibly retain about all kinds of retail issues, and for some of you, a lot of capital markets and trading type issues. But we're going to talk about something that kind of flies under the radar in our collective experience, and that has to do with the kind of niche area, at least for most people, involving the investment of public funds. And when we talk about the investment of public funds, it's kind of a broad category, but it involves various state and municipal funds that open accounts with broker-dealers for investments for their own purposes. And we're going to talk a little bit about those funds and various issues that arise from firms maintaining accounts that consist of such funds. And so, you know, the focus of this presentation is to talk about best practices on the one hand, and avoiding litigation and regulatory exposure, reducing litigation or regulatory risk on the other hand, in handling accounts that, as I said, invest various types of state and municipal funds. So I'm going to kind of give an overview, an introduction, and then I'm going to turn it over to Tom and Katie to talk about some of the issues that we have identified as important in firms analyzing accounts in this area, and as I said, reducing the risk to the firm, risk to the customers, risk to the personnel and supervisors handling the accounts and responsible for the accounts. So, you know, one of the things that is clear to us is that these kinds of accounts present certain unique risks and features for a variety of reasons, which are kind of in a shorthand way outlined on the slide in front of you. And so one of the first things you learn when you practice in this area is that there's kind of this insane thicket of individual state laws, many if not most of which are very different. They have their own quirks, their own nuances, their own substantive provisions. And so, you know, depending on the applicable state, you have an entire statutory scheme that you've got to understand and work through. And let me say, at the risk of understatement, that it's kind of like reading the Internal Revenue Code. Many of these statutes are not exactly modicums of clarity, as they say. Okay, so that's at the state level. That's challenging enough. But then in addition to the state statutes, many municipalities have their own local codes and ordinances with respect to the funds that are established in their own jurisdictions. And so you've got to take a look to see, number one, with this particular fund that you're looking at, this particular plan, is there local law, local rules, local ordinances, and if so, what do they say? Part and parcel of that analysis is the evaluation of another quirky concept as to whether the particular state has home rule or Dillon rule. Yes, that's Dillon, D-I-L-L-O-N rule, or is a hybrid. And that's important, and we're going to talk about that. Then the applicable state and local law will differ depending on the source and the purpose of the funds in the particular account. So, for example, and there's, we're going to go through some of the different kinds of funds, and there's maybe, half a dozen to a dozen combinations and permutations, but most jurisdictions have different rules for, say, the investment of tax revenues on the one hand, which are generally, short-term kind of funds. We need it. We can't afford to lose a dime. Got to use that money on a short-term basis for immediate needs. And public employee pension funds, on the other hand, which, for obvious reasons, tend to be more long-term and usually allow longer-term investments. A fourth complicating factor is that, as many of you have seen in the media from time to time, most public pension firms are substantially underfunded. The liabilities, the long-term liabilities, the short-term liabilities greatly exceed the current assets. And so one of the things firms have to do is to be very wary of local officials who, local managers of funds who have an inclination to want to take a little bit more risk to generate a little bit more return than is prudent and is allowable under the applicable statutes. Risk factor that we've identified is the IPS, the investment policy statement. And some of you are familiar with the IPS or the IP from trust accounts, because many trust and other type accounts, some trust and other type accounts have their own IPs that contain various information and restrictions, and so the IPs generally address issues like the governance for the plan, who's responsible for overseeing the plan. What are the plan's investment objectives and risk tolerance? What are permissible investments? What are the ranges of investment allocations that are permissible under the particular investment plan? What are the roles of the investment professionals who may provide various roles with provide various services with respect to the plan? And one of the things that we see is that, so on the one hand, an IPS, some of them are very well drafted and they make the lawyers and the compliance folks' jobs easier because they're clear. Others, of course, not surprisingly, are confusing, contradictory, not necessarily consistent with applicable law, and creates headaches for firms who are, have such funds, want to maintain such funds, but also have the obligation to make sure that the fund's investments are consistent with applicable law and plan documents. And then in addition to the IPS, where there is new business, what sometimes happens is that municipality puts out an RFP. So it goes out to different firms and says, okay, you guys, here's what we're looking for. We want to fill this, this kind of a role, and you guys compete. And so oftentimes the RFP, the solicitation document, the request for proposal, has its own parameters as to the types of investments or certain restrictions that may apply. And so insofar as there's a recent RFP, you got the RFP, you got the IPS, you got the state law, you got the local law, you guys figure it out. And then, in terms of risk considerations, last but not least, if you look at the final bullet here, many of these accounts have significant assets, more than certainly a typical retail account, or high net worth or ultra high net worth account, number one. So, more money, more, great assets, but also more potential risk. And then if, God forbid, something goes wrong, if it's, municipal money or municipal, quasi-municipal money, you can be on the front page of the local paper if things go sideways and the local officials are pointing fingers at the firm. So another good reason to do your homework on the front end and make sure that it's the account is being handled appropriately. We're also going to talk a little bit about the roles, different kinds of roles that firms play with respect to public fund accounts. And so you'll hear a little bit about investment, which is really essentially an advisor to the governing board of the fund. You'll hear about investment managers, which are the hands-on, usually discretionary managers of one or more particular tranches of the funds of the account. And then last but not least, the custodians who perform traditional custodial functions and often may play one of the former roles as well. And custodians provide, the custodian role provides its own unique sets of issues that firms need to be attentive to. So, as I said at the outset, our presentation is intended to provide a roadmap, a high-level overview of some of the key issues that firms should address and pay attention to in opening and utilizing public accounts. And so we're going to kick off the discussion. I'm going to turn it over to initially Tom to talk about examples of some of the primary types of public accounts, what they're intended to do, what the sources of the funds are, and why does all this good stuff matter.
Thanks, Andy. So, as we started to delve into these and see the types of funds that are typically subject to this public fund analysis, we found that there are literally dozens, and the sources vary from funding, vary from straight tax revenue to some self-funding when it comes to some of these pension plans. As a general matter, the general funds that you see for municipalities are called literally general or surplus, where general tax revenue is taken in, deposited to, and they're used for operating the municipality. Those typically are subject to the most restrictive types of investment possibilities because there's an immediate need for liquidity, and a preservation of capital is of utmost importance for those. The surplus funds differ a little bit, more significantly, in that they claim to have no immediate need for liquidity. So they're looking to grow these assets a little bit more. So typically the restrictions or the types of permissible investments are much broader than they are for a general operating fund. All are subject to both state and local law with respect to the types of investments that are permitted or not permitted. And asset is another important aspect of what we see in both the statute and the IPS for these types of funds. And they also morph into funds that are established by municipalities that establish districts. So multiple municipalities will establish a district type fund where they collaborate in order to set up a district fire department, or a fire district as it's called, a water district, a water and sewerage district. They'll even go so far as to do hospitals and fund that way, and other types of agencies on a smaller basis. Parks are typically funded this way. Again, these are pools of tax revenue from the municipality contributed to a district for purposes of establishing whatever it is they want to do. Again, you'll see these mostly home rule type things. We'll get into that a little bit more in more specificity. But it gives them greater latitude to pool their funds and use them for the purpose of the stated purpose, that is a fire department, a sewerage treatment plant, a water system, garbage disposal, a hospital, or related parks service, or related types of kind of agencies that they set up. You'll see that those funds can be invested a little bit differently as a general matter. The permissible investments there are usually fairly restrictive because of the immediate need for liquidity. So when you see those, they have a totally different statutory scheme. They operate pursuant to different governing documents, and their IP are generally just a reflection of what the government will let you do, what the municipalities are free to do in order to flourish your business. Then you'll see OPEBs or other post-employment benefits that are established by municipalities, where they will establish funding for former employees to fund healthcare contributions typically, or health insurance. These funds are, again, sometimes underfunded. They are established by both state and municipal ordinance. They also have a garden variety of restrictions with respect to what they are permitted to invest in, their long-term prospects, their issues with respect to their investment objectives, and their stated intended return. And oftentimes you'll see in an IPS between a stated objective or a return. We're looking for annual returns between, let's say, 6 to 8%. And then you see a stated investment objective of preservation of capital. So the tension there is, what are you going to invest in order to get those kind of returns as a BD, or an investment advisor to make recommendations to get there. Pensions are the next thing that we see. We see a lot of municipal type pensions.
Hey, Tom,
Yeah.
before you go on, you mentioned OPEBs, OPEBs.
Yes.
And maybe you said that, but you just, what's that acronym? What is that acronym?
I'm sorry, I thought I said it, Andy. It's other post-employment benefits. Those funds are set up for. So retirees from municipality, there are funds for purposes of funding their health care on an ongoing basis, post-employment. The pension plans that we see for municipalities are typically targeted towards a specific employment area. So they're set up typically for firefighters and police pensions, but we also see some teachers, some nurses, and those are and municipal employees, just straight municipal employees. The first thing to note with those is none of them that we've seen or come across are ERISA plans. They are non-ERISA pension funds that are set up pursuant to a granting statute from the state that allows a municipality to go ahead and establish a pension plan for a specific purpose, police, firefighters. And those have very specific restrictions through a granting statute as to the type of investment that they make, asset allocation, and the long-term objectives of the fund. These are the ones that you typically see that are underfunded, Andy mentioned before. They'll even go so far as funds within funds, in that they'll have a short-term fund, intermediate fund, and a long-term fund within a pension fund, and have different restrictions with respect to permissible investments within those. So they'll separate it into 3 or 4 parts so that they'll take more risk in one part of it, less in another, in order to gain maximum returns.
Okay, that's great. I think as Tom reviewed, one of the key takeaways is that for firms, in terms of ensuring that your public fund accounts are compliant, one of the first things you got to do is figure out which pigeonhole, which slot the particular account falls into. And as crazy as it may seem, sometimes even the clients seem not to be sure exactly where they belong, which obviously complicates things a little bit. But once you have the type of plan, you got a sense as to what you got on your hands in terms of the type of plan. Katie's going to talk about the challenges and the drill in terms of the research that firms have to do in order to get their arm around what's permissible.
So we're going to start a little bit before from what Andy started and go back to something that both Tom and Andy mentioned, Dillon and home rule, which is something you may remember from a con law class 1,000 years ago. Basically, Dillon rule, a local government can only engage in activity that is sanctioned by the state legislature. And if the state legislature hasn't legislated the authority or granted the authority to a municipality or a city or a certain agency, then they can't do it. Whereas a home rule state, the local government can perform any function unless it's specifically prohibited by a law. So if the state has not adopted a legislation, the municipality can step in. There are hybrids of these types of rules where you can look at where there's certain home rule granted to cities of a certain size, or a legislative grant of home rule through an adopted charter if a municipality determines they want to adopt the charter. So why does this matter? It defines what powers a municipality might have as to what kind of retirement plans they can authorize, and then determining how that money is invested. So then the next step is you look at what has been enacted by the legislature. And on a statutory level, states have enacted statutes that create and authorize some of the different funds that Tom was mentioning. So the OPEBs and the pension funds and the general funds and the surplus funds and the funds for hospitals and the funds for the nurses and the funds for the parks. All of that can be buried somewhere in the state statutes. So it's a little bit of an onion when you start looking. Just keep peeling away layers and layers. And these statutes, sometimes they're very detailed, and they include requirements for the IPS, which is an investment policy statement. I'm not sure if we've actually defined that at some point, which will include obviously the permissible investments that we were discussing, perhaps prohibited investments, requirements for who is allowed to invest the plan, and then how consultants are hired. They can also have requirements for a request for proposals, or the RFP, which is the public bidding mechanism that is used to hire an investment consultant or an investment manager for a public entity. And they can also provide the authority for a pension or a retirement plan with basic or default parameters, with restrictions as to investments, which could be quite draconian actually, and then provide a provision to allow a municipality to adopt an ordinance to relieve them of all of those restrictions, provided the municipality jumps through certain hoops, which usually involves the adoption of an IP and some other parameters as to investment. Which brings us to the municipal ordinance, or the municipal code, which would have the provisions for the creation of the authority for a plan, or for appropriating funds for a certain purpose. Again, this can include permissible investments and the requirements for an investment policy statement. Sometimes the municipal ordinance will defer to plan documents for pension funds or OPEBs that were in existence prior to the adoption of the ordinance. So you go a little bit deeper, and now you have to ask for collective bargaining agreements or trust agreements, or adopting resolutions from the town, from the Board of Trustees for the plan, or a pension board. Because sometimes these adopt existing plans without any detail, so you need to do some more digging into what the original documents say and what they might provide for and require.
Katie, with respect to the local rules and regulations and underlying documents, like, how do you even go about getting stuff like that, right? The state statutes, you can kind of Google it, and it's pretty available on LexisNexis, Westlaw.
Andy froze on my end. I was asking as to whether or not you go looking for these sorts of documents. And some of it is searching municipal websites. And my internet connection is unstable, so if I drop out, I apologize now. Some of it is just Googling and looking for the entities at heart and going from there. And so you can ask intelligent questions of your client as to where is the origin of this plan and where are the funds coming from, because the origin of the fund sometimes dictates how those funds can be invested.
Katie and I were surprised a few times when we were looking for stuff like this, because we found that the plan itself had a website, and we were able to find some of the documents, the enabling documents, etc., right on the plan's website that's separate from the municipality website. So it's a matter of digging.
I can't hear Andy. Can
Andy's on mute.
Okay.
There we go.
So, Katie, is that anything else on the overview with respect to state and local law and our favorite topic of Dillon versus home rule?
I think that's enough for today.
Yeah. Okay. So, right. So you know what kind of plan it is, because you've done that research, and you got a sense as to the applicable law, state and local. And then we talked about the investment policy statement, which most plans have, but some plans don't. And so, Tom, talk a little bit about what firms should be doing in terms of reviewing and analyzing the IPS for purposes of oversight of the accounts.
Right. So once you've identified controlling statutes, be they state or the local, and you have those, they'll give you a roadmap as to what is permitted or not permitted and what the plan should be doing. If you're lucky enough to have an IPS that's drafted well, they typically follow those statutes. Others do not. So the real issue becomes comparing the IPS to the statute or the local ordinance to make sure that the IPS complies. And there's a lot of analysis that goes into it, because not only do some IPSs neglect to mention things that are in statutes, they'll go beyond the statutes. And because these are granting statutes, if they go beyond, it would be typically considered something that's not permitted by the legislature or the ordinance. So reconciling those two is, as Katie described, there's a lot of layers to that onion. You have to really dig into it and understand what it is that is permitted and not. And the analysis that we typically try to undertake is we break down all the possible investments that are out there, and we compare those to what the statute or ordinance grants, and then what the IPS allows. If we find that an IPS doesn't mention a particular investment that would be permitted by statute, it's probably a good idea to mention that to your client, because that's something that they would be allowed to invest in, but the IPS has not contemplated. So bring that to their attention, because maybe that IPS needs to be amended or redrafted to comply. The ones that you struggle with the most, when there's no IPS, you're restricted just to that or the ordinance allows. Other IPS will just say anything that's legal you can do. So, which poses a bit of a problem when you don't have some enabling documents, because you're hoping that the statute that you're relying upon allows or applies to this particular plan. You're fairly confident, but when you don't have an enabling ordinance or enabling plan document, sometimes there's some issues there as well. So you really, one of the things that I think is a touchstone to this is to remember that the statutes and the ordinance are enabling. They're granting statutes. So you can't go beyond what it is they grant because the IPS says you can. Oftentimes we'll see, well, maybe not often, but we will, when we have seen instances where an IPS allows an investment that the statute does not specifically allow or does not permit, specifically does not permit. So that needs to be brought to the attention of your client as quickly as possible. So similarly, when you get into, I don't know if this is up now, Andy, but the RFP issue and the IPS, when you're responding to an RFP, it's a good idea to do the same analysis that you would if you were taking over an account that had an existing IPS, because you're going to have to comply with the statutes and the granting ordinance, and paying close attention to what it is that they are allowed to do by grant of the legislature or the municipality against what the IPS says. And if there's a creating document or a document that creates the governance for the plan, either by resolution, by ordinance, or by trust agreement, you need to look at those as well, because there are hidden nuances in those invariably that will affect the IPS.
So Tom, in terms of, we've talked about permissible investments and consistencies, potential inconsistencies between the IPS and the statutes, and some of the issues arising out of that. I talked a little bit at the outset about the three primary roles that investment professionals, representatives of broker dealers usually play one or more of those roles with respect to a little bit about what IPSs generally do or do not say with respect to the roles of the investment professionals and how that impacts or should impact the firm's review of the account and the potential risk that's presented.
Right. So in a well-drafted IPS, you'll find that the roles of the investment consultant or investment advisor versus an investment manager are well defined. And typically, as Andy said before, the manager has discretion. They are picking the investments, hopefully in accordance with the IPS that complies with the statute and ordinance, and they run with it. But the BD can also be asked to provide services that are advisory or a consultant or an advisor, where they monitor the investment manager's selections. They give advice with respect to selections, and they also monitor the plan for compliance with the IPS, which also implies that you're agreeing to monitor with respect to compliance with underlying statute. So that's a big role for the broker dealer to take on.
Yeah. So Tom, in that context, you're actually functioning essentially as the agent of the governing board of the plan. Right? They're delegating to you. They still got their responsibilities, but you in effect are executing those responsibilities in terms of overseeing the managers, ensuring compliance with the IPS allocations and reporting, what have you, right?
Absolutely. And a lot of the IPS require that you prepare a quarterly report to the board, report any deviations that the IM has made. And then there are times when there can be a conflict between the IA and the IM, and whether or not the investment advisor or the IC, investment consultant. Sorry about that.
You've been to too many public fund cocktail parties.
I guess so. So
all on Zoom.
True. So is there a conflict from a broker dealer serving as both the investment manager and the investment consultant? IPs often are silent. Statutes are often silent. Can you serve in both roles? Some do allow that. Some don't. Most are silent. I think that if you're going to serve in all roles, I think that you need to advise your client that there's an inherent conflict there. If you have a duty as a consultant to monitor the investment manager if you're acting in both roles.
Yeah, it seems like from the firm's perspective, it's at the very least it's a red flag that needs to be highlighted and addressed for the firm to determine whether it's comfortable in light of what Tom has described in terms of the kind of the inherent conflict.
And then the issue, we'll move on to the custody issue. Typically in a standard retail account from a broker dealer, you take in the account, you custody the assets, and there's no question about it. With these public funds, you have issues with respect to what are classified as qualified public depositories, or QPDs, where most states will require that the assets or the public funds are held at a QPD, which are typically banks that are chartered in that state or have their home branch in that state. They have actual brick and mortar in that state, and those assets must be custodied there. That presents some real issues for a broker dealer because they're not banks, number one, as a general matter. Two is they don't have brick and mortar in that state. And by statute, oftentimes they do not qualify to be a QPD under the state statute. There are, however, many states that have exceptions with respect to funds that are invested And as long as they're held at a registered broker-dealer, FINRA member, they're typically excluded from the requirement that the funds be placed with a QPD. The other custody issue you'll see is where there is a restriction that the funds be held with a QPD, the plan will enter into a custody agreement or a trust agreement with the QPD. The QPD will then enter into an agreement with the broker-dealer to custody those assets under a sub-custodian agreement. Statutes are typically silent with respect to this. It seems to be an industry practice. We haven't seen any cases or anything coming out of it, but it's a concern because it's not clearly defined by statute or otherwise whether or not there can be these sub-custodians, and whether or not, you know, it was intended that you couldn't hold funds in street with a broker-dealer. So if the one thing that we do see, and we don't know if there's really no way to get around it, is that pure cash oftentimes needs to be held at a QPD. So the original deposit would be held at a QPD. It can then be sent out to the broker-dealer and held in trust for that plan account. These QPDs as well, custodians of cash, oftentimes have collateral requirements that broker-dealers do not want to fulfill, nor should they fulfill. So again, the issue of taking initial deposits in without them having gone through a QPD is also of concern, unless there's a specific carve out by statute. So the custody issue tends to be something that we wrestle with for hours and hours. You wouldn't think it would take that long, but it's a very gray area in many respects.
So Tom, is it fair to say that working through the grayness, that it appears that at least in most states, that firms may act, broker-dealers may act as custodians at least with respect to investments, i.e. not cash, but with respect to investments, although as you said, it's not 100% clear in many jurisdictions.
Right, I agree. You know, except with respect to cash. Cash equivalents we struggle with sometimes, especially money market funds, but if the account is approved to hold mutual funds, we think that's okay. But CDs and cash are oftentimes restricted to QPDs, but securities, I think most states, as you said, Andy, it's a given. Well, it's not a given, but it's safe to hold those for the plan.
Okay.
Andy, we've had a request from one of our participants.
Getting pinged here. So this is the time, one of the times when we give you a secret code that's been provided by our cybersecurity experts so that you guys can sign up for CLE credit. And so there'll be a second of these notices. And so the first code is debate, D-E-B-A-T-E, debate. Very, very, very critical term. Okay, so Tom talked about this a little bit, and Katie, you know, we've gone through what to look for in an IPS. Does every municipality, does every municipal plan have an IPS? And what are the issues that firms should consider if there is no IPS?
Well, I think we touched on this a little bit. If you know what type of fund it is, if you know the origin of the funds, if you know what type of plan it is, you start with the statute. And if you don't, then you perhaps go to the municipal website or the agency's website, or you do a little bit of Googling and try and dig out exactly what the source of the funds are, or at least enough information that you can ask intelligent questions as to where the origin of these are. I know we've had experience a few times where sometimes the client can't put their finger on exactly where the funds came from. So it's a little bit of a puzzle trying to sort out exactly what statutes would apply. And so that's sort of important. And then once you figure that out, you apply the statute. The chances are that the options for investment, once you figure out what statute applies, that the options for investment can be quite limited without actually having an IP in place. So it's important to look and develop the IP if that's an option.
Yeah, and I think from our perspective and our experience, to the extent that the business client comes back and says, well, there's no IP, I think that practice pointer is that it's a good idea for legal and compliance to go back, through the appropriate channels, whoever that may be, the FA team or the branch manager, to go back to the client and say, hey guys, there's no IP, no IPS. Think about whether it would be useful to have one. Because one of the things that we have found through experience is that to the extent that there's no IPS, so among other things, there's no delineation of permissible investments or prohibited investments except insofar as it's stated in the statute. And maybe even more importantly, there's no delineation of the roles and responsibilities of the firm when you're acting as the investment consultant or simply an investment manager or even as custodian. And so, insofar as the client is always going to have expectations as to what the firm is going to be doing and how is it going to be doing it and how often is that going to happen, our sense, and I think Tom and Katie agree, is that an IP is better than no IP, and an IP that is drafted with sufficient clarity is a lot better than a crappy IP.
Yeah, and I think to your point, Andy, that the definition of the roles may be the most important thing from the broker-dealer perspective. You can always parse through the statute, figure out the permissible investments as a general matter, and use those as default. But defining the role of the broker-dealer, be it custodian, investment advisor, consultant, or investment manager, those are things that the client really should be in tune with. And the other thing is, a lot of these IPs are 40 years old, 30, 40 years old. We get them that are ancient. They've never been amended. They track the statute. And by the way, some of these statutes are pretty old too, and never been amended. So it would, just as a general matter, it would be best practice for the broker-dealer to go back to their client, suggest that they get to their IP, the roles defined, as well as put in not only the roles but the fee structure, as well as the permissible investments, and it protects everyone involved.
Yeah, and in terms of the IPs, sometimes we're very we review these things very carefully, and sometimes there are very subtle clues that give kind of insights into how old the IP is if it's not dated. For example, some of them say that they should comply with the rules of the NASD. That's a subtle clue. Some of them talk about Eisenhower's presidency.
And Kennedy is the commissioner.
But seriously, get the clients to update the RFPs, and if necessary, update them periodically. Okay, I've got a note from our cyber team that it's time for the second clue. The first one, as you remember, if you were looking, well, I'm not sure I'm supposed to say this, but the first one was circus. The first one was debate. The second is circus. So that's just another that's the word. So just for your CLE purposes, just get those. Okay. So after, we've talked about some of the unique features of the this area, this subsector of accounts, and a high-level view of some of the things that firms should think about in analyzing the accounts. And we talked about the kind of fund and the source of money and the statutory framework and the IP and or the IPS. And then, kind of at the end of the process, or not necessarily the end of the process, but as part of the process, firms have to think about, in terms of these accounts, or firms should think about the, as you would with respect to retail accounts or any other accounts, the supervisory challenges and the supervisory structure. So on the one hand, firms have most firms have all kinds of systems, some more extensive, some less extensive in terms of monitoring for suitability / Reg BI, other sales practice issues, many of which are not really applicable in the public fund space. And so a couple of considerations to think about. Number one is some kind of customized monitoring, necessary and practicable. So, if a firm has 3 of these accounts, the likelihood of automated monitoring is, probably not so great. But if a firm has more than a critical mass of accounts, whether there's systematic surveillance that can be built in, that depending on the complexity of the system or the level of detail, to monitor for issues like, best case scenario, compliance with applicable law, which is obviously going to differ state by state, plan by plan, compliance with applicable IPS or other plan documents which raise similar issues. So you have the statute, you have the statute, you have the IPS. What are you going to do going forward? So is there going to be some kind of periodic monitoring to ensure that at the end of a particular month, at the end of the quarter, at the end of the year, whatever the periodic review is, that there is a consistency between what is actually in the account and what the plan documents and the law say.
Right.
I think another key component of it that firms should think about is making sure that branch and complex managers and other supervisors who are in the chain of command are adequately trained. Again, branch and complex management folks can be really experienced and have been overseeing accounts for a long time, but overseeing retail accounts for 25 years does not necessarily mean you tune into the public fund. So that's something to think about. And then, as part of the process that we talked about, that we have been talking about for the past almost hour, but also as part of supervision, whether it's through branch management, using the FA team as your, kind of the initial go-between. But one of the things that we have found is that communication directly with the client, the representatives of the municipality or their lawyer, governmental authorities, to the extent that you have questions and issues about state statutes that may not be as clear as we would like to see them. That proactiveness here, as it is with most things, what we deal in and supervision, a proactive approach, I think, is we have found is very useful.
Yeah, and to the monitoring issue, it's one thing to be able to restrict account from making or allowing a certain type of security to be purchased in the account. The real issue, because I think most PDs can do that pretty handily, the issue then becomes if you have an IP or a state statute or an ordinance that has asset allocation restrictions, where you're only allowed to have 20% of the value of the account invested in equities, 50 has to be in bonds or whatever, and then subsets of bonds. They have to be AAA, some can be munis, some can't be. They all have to be investment grades. And a requirement by statute or IPS that if you exceed, you divest within a reasonable time that you exceed. So monitoring that can pose issues for a broker dealer too, for those accounts.
Things. Well, we've talked a bit. We talked a lot about permissible investments and kind of at a high level, and you think about, well, there's equities and fixed income and alternatives, but some of the statutes and some of the IPs get into like really detailed. It's got to be rated at least this. The issuance has to have consisted of at least X million dollars. The issuer has to have been in existence at least Y number of years. So in terms of establishing systems that can track this stuff, it can get really complex.
Or in some states, it needs to be headquartered in that state.
Yeah. Okay. So we're almost done. And so let's just talk briefly, Tom and Katie, about some other, kind of like one-off issues that we've seen, or last thoughts about, takeaways in terms of stuff that's important. So the first item, I think we've already talked about, the stale statutes and IPSs. When you guys address ETFs and mutual funds?
So a lot of the statutes never even considered ETFs. It didn't exist when the statutes were written. Most of the IPs would like to invest in ETFs. There's no statutory authority for it. You'll have crazy, well, maybe not crazy, but AG or OFI or Commissioner of Insurance opinions saying, oh, we've reviewed the statute, we think it's okay, it's consistent with it. That poses an issue because that's not final. The legislature has final word there. So we go back and we talk to the client about it and see where that heads. Mutual funds pose some of the same issues, where there were, mutual funds weren't really around when some of these things were drafted, and so we struggle with that. Although a lot of the statutes not a, most statutes do contemplate mutual funds. But then dividing the mutual funds up into you have to allocate them as part of the equity portfolio, fixed income portfolio. What's in the mutual funds can cause some heartburn as well, because there are conflicting opinions between attorneys general and the OFI or the Commissioner of Insurance as to what those mean for S&O. Katie, I know I had a lot of that time.
It's okay. I think,
Thank you.
no, I was going to say, I think that the last part of that slide, the inconsistencies with investment objectives, risk tolerances, and return expectations and permissible investments all sort of ties back to what you were already talking about with the stale statutes and the IPSs, is that you'll have an IP that was originally drafted 30 years ago and maybe reaffirmed every 3, 4, 5 years, and maybe they go in and plug in a new number for what the return expectation is, and that's not necessarily in line with what permissible investments are out there or what the market's doing and how we're going to monitor all of those things. So these are things just to be sort of aware of and making sure that everything is sort of marching in the same line.
Right, and so I think the takeaway there is that if the risk tolerance in the IP is talks about preservation of capital, then they have a return objective year over year of 8%. You know, that's a red flag. Like, hey guys, we need to.
And they're only allowed to invest in municipals and treasuries.
And treasuries, right?
Okay, so this concludes our public fund presentation. Thank you to everybody for joining us. We hope that that you found this interesting and illuminating. And we're looking forward to our next presentation, which, if your screen is not blocked out, you'll see that it's the aging workforce and financial something, diminished capacity, vulnerable investors and exploitation. And it's Wednesday, October something, 12:30 to 1:30. And remember that the second secret code for stealing credit is circus. Okay, so thanks very much. We're signing off.
Thank you.